Recording on. Hello everyone. In today's session, we're going to discuss how to find the assumption in critical reasoning questions. As you're aware, verbal section on the GMAT, you have three different question types: sentence correction, critical reasoning, and reading comprehension. In today's session, we're going to discuss how to find the assumption in a critical reasoning argument. First, let's see the structure of critical reasoning questions. Most of the questions on critical reasoning give you a short passage or an argument. You have a short passage that you'll come across. In most of the cases, we call the short passage as an argument. So it is important to understand what constitutes an argument. An argument is something wherein an author offers reason or reasons in support of a conclusion. So in an argument, the author offers reasons in support of a conclusion. So to call something as an argument, you should have two things: reasons which support the conclusion. Reason or reasons that support the conclusion are called as premise or evidence. Conclusion is the position of the author. Conclusion is the position of the author. Let's look at this example. Ships appear to drop out of sight as they sail away. Therefore, the earth cannot be flat. Now, if you look at the argument, what is the point that the author is trying to prove? The point that the author is trying to prove is that the earth cannot be flat. So this is called as the position of the author or the conclusion. Now, what reasons support the conclusion? Ships appear to drop out of sight as they sail away. So you call this as an evidence, premise or evidence. All right. So an argument consists of certain evidences that the author uses to take a position, which is called as the conclusion of the argument. Right. The structure of an argument, the author uses certain evidences to jump to a conclusion. Remember, conclusion is never the next thing that comes out from the evidence. If you look at the evidence here, the author talks about ships dropping out of sight. On the other hand, if you look at the conclusion, the author says the earth cannot be flat, right? So based on certain evidences, the author jumps to a conclusion, right? So in the process of coming to the conclusion based on the evidence, the author takes something for granted, right? So the third part of an argument, which is never explicitly stated in an argument, but upon which the argument relies, is called as an assumption of the argument. So assumption is something that an author assumes to come to the conclusion based on the evidence. For example, if your argument was something like this: Mike weighs less than 200 pounds. Therefore, it is unlikely that Mike will become a successful race car driver. Now, in this argument, the conclusion is that Mike cannot become a successful race car driver. Now, the evidence that supports the conclusion is Mike weighs less than 200 pounds. Now, what is the assumption that I have to assume to come to this conclusion based on the evidence? I should obviously assume that to become a successful race car driver, one should weigh at least 200 pounds. Only then my argument will hold true, right? So the assumption is something that is not stated in an argument, but it is something that an author assumes based on the evidence to come to the conclusion. So if you look at the structure of an argument, the premise or the evidence and the assumption will help the author to come to the conclusion. Now, in an argument, you're given the premise, you're given the conclusion. Now, it's your job to identify the conclusion and the premise to come up with the author's assumption, right? So what is the difference between an assumption and a premise? A premise or an evidence are stated facts or information. An assumption is an unstated evidence. And what does an assumption do? It is an unstated evidence that bridges the gap between the premise and the conclusion. So to sum it up, your argument has three parts or three building blocks. One is the premise or the evidence, which are supporting facts or information. Next is the conclusion, which is the position of the author. So something that the author persuades the readers to believe that it is true is nothing but the conclusion of the argument. And the third part and the fundamental or the building block of an argument is an assumption. It is an unstated evidence that the author assumes to come to the conclusion based on the premise or the evidence that is stated in the argument. Right? So as I've said, these are the three parts of an argument: conclusion, premise or evidence, and the assumption. Right? So this slide summarizes whatever we have discussed. Conclusion is the position of the author, something that the author is persuading you to believe that it is true. Premise or evidence are supporting facts or information that the author uses to support the conclusion. And an assumption is an unstated evidence that bridges the gap between the premise and the conclusion. So questions on critical reasoning. One type of question on critical reasoning will ask you to find the author's assumption. So in such questions, which we are discussing today, you have to identify the conclusion first and the premise to know what the author has assumed, because that is what the question will ask you to do. So before we try to identify the assumption, let's look at an argument and we'll try to understand what the conclusion is and what the evidence is in that particular argument. So let's read an argument. Take a couple of seconds, read the argument, and let me know what is the evidence and the conclusion. Let's read the argument and identify the conclusion and the evidence. Many cyclists use masks to protect them from city air pollution. The filters in the mask are effective against most pollutants, but only for approximately 30 days. Therefore, all users of such masks who wish to maintain their health should replace them regularly. Now, the moment you read the argument, ask yourself, what is the position of the author? Now, what is the author persuading the reader to believe? You have the clue word therefore, right? So what is the author's conclusion? That all users of masks who wish to maintain their health should replace them regularly. So this is the conclusion of the argument. Now, all the sentences in the argument, apart from the conclusion, are evidences. You never have one single evidence. You have a set of evidences that the author uses to come to a conclusion. Now look at the evidences here. The first one is many cyclists use masks to protect them from city air pollution. The second one is the filters of the mask are effective against most pollutants, but only for approximately 30 days. Now, out of these two evidences, it is important for you to identify which of these evidences directly support the author's conclusion, right? Now, why is the author saying that users of the mask who wish to maintain their health should replace them regularly? Because the filters are effective for only 30 days. So the second sentence or the second evidence is a reason that directly supports the author's conclusion. So what is the first sentence? And the first sentence is also an evidence, but it is an evidence that is building up the context. That is an evidence that builds up the context. So to answer assumption questions, we focus on the evidence that supports the conclusion and the conclusion. The remaining evidences in the argument is something that the author uses to build up the context, right? So we have to identify the conclusion of the argument and the evidence that supports the conclusion, because that is where your gap is, and hence you can predict the missing link and thereby knowing what the assumption of the argument is. All right, now let's go ahead and look at an assumption question. What is an assumption? Something that we have just discussed. It's an unstated evidence and it bridges the gap between the premise and the conclusion. So this we have already discussed. The evidence or the premise and the assumption will help the author to come to the conclusion, which is the position of the argument. So you identify the conclusion, identify the evidence to understand or to come up with a statement that would bridge the gap, which is nothing but the author's assumption. Read this argument, identify the conclusion and the evidence. After you do that, we'll go ahead and see how to predict the assumption. So in order to predict the assumption, we get into the shoes of the author, understand what is the gap between the evidence and the conclusion, come up with a statement that would bridge the gap. I take a couple of seconds, Read the argument, identify the conclusion and the evidence. From there, we'll predict the assumption together. Let's read the argument to identify the conclusion and the evidence. A famous singer recently won a lawsuit against an advertising firm for using another singer in a commercial to evoke the famous singer's well-known rendition of a certain song. As a result of the lawsuit, the advertising firms will stop using imitators in commercials. Therefore, the advertising costs will rise since famous singer services cost more than those of their imitators. Now, what is the position of the author? You have the indicator word therefore, which makes it very evident that the conclusion is that the advertising costs will rise. This is the position of the author, that the costs will rise. Now, why is the author saying the costs will rise? Everything other than the conclusion are evidences, but there are two reasons that support, main reasons. One is the lawsuit, that the firms cannot use imitators. The other reason is, since is also used to give a reason, and the other reason is famous singer services cost more than those of their imitators. Now, let's jot down the conclusion and the evidence, and let's see how to come up with the assumption, how to identify the author's assumption. So as we have discussed, conclusion is that the advertising costs will rise. The evidence is there are two reasons that the author uses. One is the lawsuit, which says the firms cannot use imitators. Second reason is that the services of the famous singers cost more than the services of the imitators. Right? Now, what do we do next? Understand the gap in the argument. Understand the gap between the evidence and the conclusion so that you can predict what is the author's assumption. Right? So let's understand the gap. The lawsuit says the advertising firms cannot use imitators. Based on this, the author concludes the advertising costs should rise. So what should the author assume? If the firms cannot use imitators and if the advertising cost should rise, then how is it possible? What should the author assume? That the firms should use famous singers. If they can't use imitators and if the advertising cost should rise, the only possibility is, only thing that the author should assume is that the firms will continue to use famous singers. Now, how do we know if the firms will use famous singers, the cost will rise? It is already given that famous singer services is costlier than the services of the imitators. So what is the assumption? That the advertising firms will use famous singers, or the other way to paraphrase it is the advertising firms will continue to use well-known renditions of certain songs. If they're going to continue to use well-known renditions of songs, then obviously they have to use famous singers. So what's the assumption? Firms will use famous singers, or the firms will use well-known renditions of certain songs. Right? So only when the author assumes this is when the conclusion or the argument will hold true. So how do we come up with the assumption? We have understood the gap between the argument. The firms cannot use imitators, the advertising cost should rise. So what should the author assume to conclude that the cost should rise? The author should assume that the firms will continue to use famous singers, or the firms will continue to use well-known renditions of songs. So this is how we come up with the assumption. Identify the conclusion, identify the evidence, understand the gap between the conclusion and the evidence, and come up with a statement that would bridge the gap. Come up with a statement that would bridge the gap. So to identify the assumption, we get into the shoes of the author to come up with the missing link that is not stated in the argument, which is the author's assumption. So let's look at the approach to crack finding the assumption questions. So if you have looked at the structure of critical reasoning questions on the GMAT, just go through a question. This is how your question will look like. You will have an argument, right, which is then followed by a question stem, is then followed by 5 answer choices, out of which you have to pick up the best answer. All right, so most of the questions will follow this pattern. You have the argument first, followed by the question stem next, and then 5 answer choices A through E, out of which you have to pick up the best answer. Right, now let's look at the approach to crack the assumption question. First step is you read the question stem. Now you may ask me, why do we start reading the question stem, not the argument? Because your approach is based on the question type. So you start off reading the question stem to identify the question type. Remember, assumption questions, you will usually have one of these two words, assume or assumption. One of these two words in the question stem will help you identify that you're dealing with an assumption question. So what do we do first? You read the question stem first. This is the first thing that we do. Read the question stem, right? So you read the question stem, identify the question type. Then step 2, you read the argument. Why do we read the argument? We have just done it in the example that we have discussed earlier. You read the argument to identify the conclusion and the evidence, right? So you read the argument, identify the conclusion and the premise or the evidence, right? That's the second step. Third step, be very cautious here. The third step doesn't say read the answer choices. The third step says predict the answer. We predict the answer, we predict the assumption. What kind of a statement do we predict? Something that bridges the gap between the evidence and the conclusion. So step 3, you come up with the assumption by understanding the gap between the evidence and the conclusion. That is your third step. After you do that, fourth step, that's when you start reading the answer choices. As a result, you eliminate wrong answer choices. So you read the answer choices, look for an answer choice that matches with the predicted answer. As a result, what do? You eliminate the wrong answer choices. Remember, only after the third step, that's when you move to the answer choices, look for an answer choice that matches with the predicted answer, and you eliminate wrong answer choices. Following the approach is very important. Don't skip the third step, right? Because if you don't have the habit of predicting the assumption, then it becomes difficult when you answer the other question types in critical reasoning. You may not predict the entire sentence, but at least predict what the assumption should talk about. Like it should talk about a famous singer, or it should talk about the advertising firm, or the advertising firm and the famous singer. If you're not able to come up with the statement, at least come up with terms that the assumption should address so that it becomes easier for you to eliminate the answer choices, right? So keeping the approach in mind, let's look at the first question. Right? So I'll give you a minute or a minute and a half. Go ahead, read the question, follow the approach, and try to answer it. And after that, we'll start discussing. All right, let's answer this question. So the first thing that we do is we read the question stem, right? So what does the question stem say? Which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? So the word assumption in the question stem should give us a clue that we'll be dealing with an assumption question, finding the assumption question, right? Now let's read the argument to identify the conclusion and the evidence. Most household appliances use electricity only when in use. Many microwave ovens, however, have a built-in clock and so use some electricity even when they are not in use. The clocks each consume about 45 kilowatt per year. Therefore, households whose microwave oven has no built-in clock use 45 kilowatt per year less on average than do comparable households whose microwave oven is otherwise similar but has a built-in clock. Now, what is the position of the author? It's very clear here. You have the word therefore indicating the conclusion. So what is the conclusion? My households who are having a micro oven without a clock consume less energy than households who are having a similar micro oven with a built-in clock, right? So that's the conclusion. Now, all the sentences in the argument apart from the conclusion are evidences. The first sentence is an evidence, second is an evidence, the third is also an evidence. But as I've just said earlier, we primarily focus on the evidence that supports the conclusion. Why is the author saying households whose micro oven has no built-in clock use 45 kilowatts per year less on average than do households whose micro oven is otherwise similar but has a built-in clock? Because it is the clock that consumes that additional amount of energy. It is the clock that consumes that additional amount of energy. So what is the main reason? Clock consumes 45 kilowatt per year on average, right? So if you look at the first two sentences are also evidences, but what are they doing in the argument? They're trying to build up a context for the author to build his or her argument. The first two sentences, they try to show a difference between the other household appliances and the microwave ovens. What is the difference? Most appliances do not use electricity when they are not in use, but micro ovens are different. How are they different? They use electricity even when they are not in use. So to show this difference, the author gives the first two sentences to build up the context. But the evidence that directly supports the conclusion is it is the clock that consumes that additional amount of energy. Therefore, households who are having a micro oven without a clock use 45 kilowatts per year less on average than do comparable households whose micro oven is otherwise similar but has a built-in clock. Right? Now let's try to come up with the assumption. What is the missing link that the author should assume based on the evidence to come to this conclusion? Now, as I've said earlier, we may not be able to predict the sentence, but let's at least predict what the answer choice or the assumption should talk about. Now, the conclusion compares households having a micro oven without a clock and households having a micro oven with a clock. So the assumption should also compare households having a micro oven without a clock, households having a micro oven with a clock. And what does an assumption do? It bridges the gap between the evidence and the conclusion. So it should talk about households having a micro oven without a clock, with a clock, and it should talk about the clock. That's when you bridge the gap between the evidence and the conclusion. So in other words, the right answer choice should talk about the clock, households having a micro oven without a clock, households having a micro oven with a clock, right? So this is what your right answer choice should address. Eventually on the GMAT, may not be true for this question, but you may find more than one answer choice that talks about these three things, in which case you have no other option but to evaluate the answer choice, right? But I hope you're clear, you have understood as to how you come up with the assumption. Assumption has to bridge the gap. The evidence talks about clocks consuming some amount of energy. Now the conclusion says households having a micro oven without a clock consume less energy than households having a micro oven with a built-in clock. So to bridge the gap, you have to talk about households having a micro oven without a clock, with a clock, hold the same comparison as in the conclusion, and you should also talk about the clock. That's when you bridge the gap between the evidence and the conclusion. Now look for an answer choice that talks about these three things, right? Let's look at the answer choices. At the same time, let's also evaluate each of the answer choice on its own method, right? Let's read answer choice A. Households that do not have a micro oven use less energy per year on average than do households that have a micro oven. Now, if you look at the argument, your argument compares households who have a micro oven with a clock to households who are having a similar micro oven without a built-in clock. We are not comparing households that do not have a micro oven to households that have a micro oven. So what's wrong with answer choice A? Answer choice A makes an irrelevant comparison. Answer choice A makes an irrelevant comparison. Clear? Let's move to the next answer choice. Choice B. Micro ovens with a built-in clock do not generally cost more to buy than micro ovens without a built-in clock. Are we talking about the cost of the micro oven? Is it anywhere related to the argument? Obviously no. So answer choice B is out of scope. Right? Let's look at choice C. All households that have a micro oven also have either a gas oven or a conventional electric oven. Good. But how does it help us in understanding what the assumption is? Doesn't make a difference. They can have a gas oven, electric oven, or they may have some other oven. Doesn't have any impact on this argument. So answer choice C is also out of scope. Right? Now let's look at choice D. Households whose micro oven does not have a built-in clock are no more likely to have a separate electric clock plugged in than households whose micro oven has one. Now, if you look at choice D, it talks about households whose micro oven does not have a built-in clock. It talks about a separate electric clock. It talks about households whose micro oven has one. Has one is what? Has a built-in clock. So it talks about all the three things that we discussed should be present in the assumption, right? So can be a possible answer. We'll come back and evaluate D. Let's hold D for a while now, right? E. There are more households that have a micro oven with a built-in clock than there are households that have a micro oven without a built-in clock. Anywhere in the argument, are we talking about the number of households? Not related. How many households are there? You're not talking about the average consumption in an area. So you're not talking about the number of households that are present. So E also makes an irrelevant comparison. So we can eliminate choice E, right? Now let's evaluate D further. Now what does D say? Households whose micro oven does not have a built-in clock are no more likely to have a separate electric clock plugged in than households whose micro oven has one. Now, so you're talking about two things. Households having a micro oven without a clock, households having a micro oven with a built-in clock, right? So this is a household having a micro oven without a built-in clock. This is a micro oven. Households having a micro oven with a built-in clock. Now what is option D saying? Households whose micro oven does not have a built-in clock are no more likely to have a separate electric clock plugged in. So households who are having a micro oven without a built-in clock, they are no more likely to plug in an additional clock. It says these people will not plug in an additional clock. So if households who are having a micro oven without a clock do not separately plug in an additional clock, then what will obviously happen? Households who are having a micro oven without a clock will obviously consume less energy than households having a micro oven with a built-in clock. Why? Because it is the clock that consumes that additional amount of energy. So only when choice D is true, that's when the argument will hold true. So what's the answer? D. All right. Now, the other way to check if you have identified the correct assumption or not is to use the negation test. Now, let me briefly explain how to use the negation test. Remember, based on certain evidences, the author jumps to a conclusion. So what does an assumption do? It will bridge the gap. An assumption bridges the gap between the evidence and the conclusion. So what should happen to the argument if you negate an assumption? If you negate an assumption, the argument should fall apart, which means negating an assumption will weaken the argument. Negating an assumption will weaken the argument. So if D is your assumption, after I negate choice D, it should weaken the argument. If this is true, then it means you have picked up the right assumption, right? So if I negate choice D, what should happen to the argument? It should weaken the argument. Now let's look at choice D. It says households whose micro oven does not have a built-in clock are no more likely to have a separate electric clock plugged in than households whose micro oven has one. So if you have to negate choice D, I can remove the word no here, right? So it becomes households whose micro oven does not have a built-in clock are more likely to have a separate electric clock plugged in than households whose micro oven has one. So what are you saying? After negating D, this is what you say. Households having a micro oven without a clock, you're saying they will plug in an additional clock than households whose micro oven has a built-in clock. If households who are having a micro oven without a clock plug in an additional clock, then what will happen to the power consumption? Households having a micro oven without a clock will almost consume the same amount of energy as households having a micro oven with a built-in clock. Why? Because the first group has plugged in separate clocks, and the evidence clearly says it is the clock that consumes that additional amount of energy. So after you negate choice D, what are we trying to say? You're trying to infer that households having a micro oven without a clock will consume the same amount of energy as households having a micro oven with a built-in clock. Whereas, what does the argument conclude? The argument concludes that households having a micro oven without a clock consume less energy than households having a micro oven with a built-in clock. So what is choice D doing after we negate? It says they consume the same amount of energy. So D after negation weakens the argument. Therefore, D is your assumption, right? So whether you predict the answer, pick up the correct answer choice, whether you evaluate the answer choices and look for an answer choice that has to be true when the argument holds true, or whether you use a negation test to check whether you have identified the correct answer or not, no matter which method you follow, you'll still come down to the right answer choice. But the important thing is following the approach of predicting what the assumption should talk about and then identifying the assumption, right? So this is how you identify the assumption in critical reasoning questions.